Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise to speak briefly to this bill. I rise to support my colleagues. I'll start by saying what others have said, which is that it's a bad bill. I have 3 children, and at the ages that they're at, I feel like the conversation in my house is always about rules. Like, you know, you can't do this at this time, or this is a rule, and like, you know, why do I have to follow the rule? Well, because I'm your parent. Well, who cares? You know what I mean? Whatever it is, it's about following the rules. And so, first of all, the government did not follow the rules. And that has been pointed out by my colleagues. This bill is in contravention of the Municipal Government Act. But in this chamber, we don't just follow the rules, we make the rules. And it is our job to make the rules better. And when I was young, the way that I learned about systemic racism was through the story of Africville. And the way that I met the member for Preston was through working on land titles years and years ago, before our political lives started. And so we know in those cases, which certainly would raise the concern of any community that has experienced the kind of systemic racism regarding land, which has been spoken about in this House today, would be rightly and deeply suspicious of any legislation that infringed on what little progress has been made in that area or threatened to infringe on it. And yet, we have a government that seemingly is not able to either articulate or care or pursue this job that we have, which is to make better rules, to know better and to do better. And so my colleague, the member for Halifax Needham, spoke about the legislation that was passed, the anti-racism legislation that was passed in this House, the purpose of which was to avoid situations like this, because that we know that systemic racism is often invisible to the folks making the rules. It is, and that's just how it is. And so our job is to make that visible. And one of the jobs of that legislation is to make that visible, to make visible the disproportionate impact of the legislation that moves through this House on different communities. And this is a test case. This is a test case of that, because any government at any time can always stand behind the defense of, well, that's not how it was intended. That's not how we planned it. That's not what we want it to be. And we hear that every day, every time we debate legislation. If it's controversial, the government will say, well, we're doing this for this reason. And often, on behalf of our constituents, we might say, well, we think it might have this other impact, or we think there might be this other reason. But in this case, I think the most charitable interpretation, which I have no reason to believe is not the right one, insofar as this bill has the potential to impact historically African Nova Scotian communities and Indigenous communities and others, is that it was an oversight. But that's not a good enough excuse. If it was an oversight, fix it. We tried to fix it on Thursday. The government, as has been mentioned, brought forward an amendment that did respond to some of the specific requests from the Decade for People of African Descent, and that letter has been tabled, but it didn't go far enough. And I think that we understand that it didn't go far enough. I think the government probably understands that it didn't go far enough. And so now, I think the government has to answer the question of why they're not taking that feedback. You know, we have a lot of really pressing issues in this province. And the legislation that is moving through the House today and tomorrow addresses very little of it. I think the government would say it sets the table for them to be able to address it, although we vigorously disagree on the means that they're taking to do that. But nonetheless, the issues are urgent. And I think for folks who I speak to who have real concerns about their security of tenure, where they live, how they're able to experience that, who have a history of dispossession and marginalization, it is incumbent upon the government to know better and to do better. So I want to close by saying again, we're making the rules here. And this government has an opportunity to make rules that are just and fair and don't have a disproportionately negative impact and don't even have the potential to. It doesn't matter what the purpose is. It matters what the impact is. Yes. And this bill has the clear capacity to have an incredibly negative impact on the lives of many folks. And so I would join with my colleagues to ask once again that the minister take this bill back to the department and bring it back in a way that is compliant with provincial legislation, that does not perpetuate systemic racism, and that respects all orders of government.